Holiday Hexes and Heartstrings, a paranormal holiday rom-com with a cursed spellcaster and festive chaos. By Wynne Valentine. Copyright 2024 by Wynne Valentine. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored, or transmitted in any form by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, scanning, or otherwise without written permission from the publisher. It is illegal to copy this book, post it to a website, or distribute it by any other means without permission. This novel is entirely a work of fiction. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or localities is entirely coincidental. Wynne Valentine asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers and the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book. Book cover by Dana Sacco. Audiobook by Google Play. Chapter 1, Unwelcome Inheritance. Tessa Marsh white-knuckled the steering wheel of her rental car as it lurched up yet another switchback. The GPS had given up 20 minutes ago, leaving her with nothing but a cryptic set of directions from her great-aunt's lawyer and a steadily worsening snowstorm.
Of all the months to die and leave me a house,
she muttered, squinting through the windshield.
Couldn't have waited until April? After tax season.
The wipers fought a losing battle against the thickening snow, their rhythmic swooshing matching her mounting headache. Tessa pulled the crumpled letter from her coat pocket, scanning the formal text she'd practically memorized. To my great-niece Tessa Marsh, I leave Winterheart Manor and all its peculiarities. She snorted. Peculiarities was one way to put it. Great-Aunt Adelaide had been the family mystery, the eccentric sister of her grandmother who'd vanished into Vermont's back country decades ago. The rest of the family never spoke of her, except in whispered conversations that stopped whenever young Tessa entered the room. Her mother had only mentioned Adelaide once, on a rare night when too much wine had loosened her tongue.
The Winterheart women,
her mother had said, staring into her glass with unusual intensity.
We all have a choice to make. Adelaide chose magic. I chose reality.
Then she'd straightened her sensible blazer and changed the subject to Tessa's college applications. A gust of wind rocked the small sedan, and Tessa cursed under her breath. This was exactly why she'd left Vermont for Boston. Civilization, properly plowed roads, and most importantly, a complete lack of mysterious family estates appearing out of nowhere to derail her carefully planned life. The headlights caught something through the swirling white, a massive iron gate that seemed to materialize from the gloom. Beyond it, Winterheart Manor thrust up against the darkening sky like something from a Gothic nightmare. Frost-covered spires pierced the low clouds, while stone gargoyles leered down from their perches, their features distorted by icicles. The manor seemed to shimmer slightly, like a mirage in desert heat. Tessa blinked hard, remembering stories her mother had told about people driving right past the property, their eyes sliding away as if the entire estate simply didn't exist. But she could see it clearly now, every Gothic detail razor-sharp in her vision. The inheritance had changed something fundamental, making the invisible suddenly, startlingly real.
Oh, you have got to be kidding me.
Tessa pulled up to the gate, already calculating renovation costs. The property taxes alone would be astronomical. As she reached for the gate, a strange thing happened. The iron creaked and swung inward on its own as if welcoming her. Tessa blinked, then shook her head. Weird acoustics. Old hinges. There had to be a logical explanation that didn't involve her sleep-deprived brain cooking up horror movie scenarios. The driveway curved through overgrown grounds, snowdrifts piling against what might have once been sculpted hedges. Tessa parked as close to the front steps as she dared, grabbed her overnight bag, and steeled herself for the trek to the door. The wind seemed to have a personal vendetta against her sensible wool coat, whipping it around her legs as she waded through knee-deep snow. By the time she reached the front door, her practical boots were soaked through and her fingers had gone numb around the ring of ancient keys the lawyer had given her.
Come on,
She muttered, trying key after key in the massive lock.
some of us are freezing to death out here.
The fifth key finally caught, and the door swung open with a horror movie-worthy creak. The foyer beyond was straight out of a period drama, if that drama had been abandoned for 50 years. Marble floors stretched into shadow, their elegant patterns obscured by dust. A crystal chandelier hung overhead like a frozen waterfall, draped in cobwebs that stirred in some unfelt draft. Oil portraits lined the walls, their subjects' eyes following her with painted disapproval. Tessa pulled out her phone, hoping to at least check current market values for historic properties in the area. No signal. Perfect,
Okay,
she announced to the empty house, her voice echoing.
let's see what we're working with. Probably looking at a complete electrical overhaul, new plumbing.
She trailed off as the few lit candles in wall sconces suddenly flickered and died, plunging the foyer into gray twilight. A cold breeze brushed the back of her neck. Tessa spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs, and found herself face to face with a man who definitely hadn't been there a second ago. He seemed to coalesce from the shadows themselves, tall and elegant in an old-fashioned coat that would have looked ridiculous on anyone else. His deep green eyes literally gleamed in the dim light, with what looked suspiciously like actual magic.
Welcome to Winterheart Manor,
He said, executing a formal bow that belonged in another century entirely.
I am Elias Winterheart, and I'm afraid you've inherited quite a bit more than just a house.
Tessa's mind raced through possible explanations. Elaborate prank, mental break from tax season stress, hypothermia hallucination. She settled for dry sarcasm.
Right. And I'm Santa Claus.
She discreetly reached for her phone again, wondering if the local psychiatric facility had good Yelp reviews. Elias's lips twitched.
Your skepticism is understandable, Miss Marsh. Perhaps a demonstration.
He lifted one gloved hand with an elegant twist of his wrist. Snowflakes materialized in the air between them, dancing in a spiral that defied both gravity and Tessa's entire understanding of reality. They sparkled with an inner light, casting prismatic patterns across the marble floor. Tessa backed away, until she hit a dust-covered side table.
That's not possible.
Her voice came out embarrassingly weak.
There has to be some kind of projection system, or…
I assure you it's quite real,
The snowflakes dissipated with another gesture.
as is the curse that binds me to this place. A rather inconvenient situation that your inheritance has now made somewhat more complicated.
Complicated?
Tessa latched onto her plans like a lifeline.
Listen, Mr. Winterheart. I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I'm here to assess the property for sale. That's it. I have clients waiting, deadlines.
Sell.
The temperature in the foyer plummeted. Frost crept across the windows in delicate, threatening patterns.
I'm afraid that won't be possible. The manor's magic is tied to the Winterheart bloodline. Your bloodline, through your mother's family.
Magic isn't real.
Tessa snapped, even as she watched ice crystals form on the mirror above the fireplace.
And even if it was, you can't just hold a property hostage with parlor tricks and cold fronts.
The manor's magic is selective.
Elias explained, his voice taking on a lecturer's tone that somehow made him seem both more human and more otherworldly.
Only those with Winterheart blood can truly see it without invitation. Others might glimpse it occasionally, like catching movement in the corner of your eye, but they'll forget almost immediately. Unless
He gestured, and the air around them sparkled with frost.
they're specifically welcomed by a Winterheart. Then the manor's magic recognizes them as guests, allowing them to see and enter freely, though they can never stay past sunrise without a new invitation.
Tessa glanced toward the still open door, where snow continued to fall in perfectly straight lines despite the howling wind.
And the protective barrier? The one keeping you here?
That's different magic entirely. Ancient spells woven into the very foundation stones. The curse binds me here as guardian, but it also protects those who enter. No harm can come to anyone within these walls, though I should warn you the manor's definition of harm can be rather creative.
His lips twitched.
It once decided that a dinner guest's fashion choices were causing emotional damage, and transformed their entire wardrobe mid-meal.
Tessa crossed her arms, skepticism written in every line of her body.
And I'm supposed to just take your word for all this?
Elias's expression darkened.
You require proof? Very well.
He strode toward the still open front door, his movements carrying a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural. The closer he got to the threshold, the more his form seemed to waver, like heat distortion on summer pavement. When he reached the doorway, an invisible barrier flared with blue light, stopping him cold.
I cannot leave,
he said quietly, one hand pressed against the barrier as if testing its strength for the 1000th time.
I haven't been able to, for longer than you've been alive. The curse ensures that a Winterheart must always remain as the manor's guardian.
His green eyes met hers, carrying the weight of decades of solitude.
And now that you've inherited. Your great-aunt Adelaide was the last true guardian,
Elias explained, his fingers tracing frost patterns on the library table.
She understood what it meant to be a Winterheart woman. The magic runs strongest through the female line. When she realized she was dying, she made arrangements to pass the manor to you.
Why me?
Tessa demanded.
I have cousins. My mother.
Your mother rejected her heritage.
Elias said gently.
And magic, once rejected, cannot be reclaimed. But you...
His eyes gleamed with that unsettling magical light.
You never rejected it because you were never given the choice. Adelaide watched you from afar, saw your potential even when you were a child. She knew you'd be the one to either embrace the legacy or end it forever.
Tessa's razor-sharp retort died in her throat. Something in his voice, in the defeat lurking behind his formal manner, struck an unexpected chord. She knew what it was like to be trapped, even if her prison was built of spreadsheets and expectations rather than magic. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the howl of the wind outside. Finally, Tessa's practical nature reasserted itself.
I need to think. And possibly drink. Heavily.
The manor's wine cellar is quite extensive,
Elias offered, a hint of wry humor returning to his voice.
though I should warn you, some of the bottles have developed interesting magical properties over the centuries.
Of course they have.
Tessa pinched the bridge of her nose.
Look, I'll stay tonight. Just until the storm passes. Then we can figure out whatever this is.
Elias inclined his head in acknowledgement. Without another word, he stepped backward into a shadow and simply vanished, leaving Tessa alone in the vast foyer with her crumbling worldview and the distinct feeling that her carefully ordered life had just been hit by a metaphysical snowball. Chapter 2: The Curse Revealed. Tessa stared into her teacup, watching steam rise in perfect spirals that definitely defied the laws of thermodynamics. She hadn't made the tea, it had simply appeared on the kitchen counter when she'd stumbled in, desperate for caffeine and answers, preferably in that order.
The tea won't bite,
Elias said, his boots clicking against the stone floor as he paced. Each step left a delicate pattern of frost that melted seconds later.
though I can't promise the same for the sugar cubes. They've developed something of an attitude over the years.
She took a cautious sip. It was perfect, exactly how she liked it. That somehow made it worse.
All right,
She said, setting the cup down with perhaps more force than necessary.
explain. Everything.
Elias stopped pacing, but before he could speak, a new voice cut through the kitchen's morning quiet.
Oh, darlings.
Announced a crisp British accent that reminded Tessa of those snooty fashion show judges she occasionally watched late at night. She whirled to find the decorative wreath on the wall somehow, preening its own berries.
Let's see what we have here, shall we?
It bobbed closer to Tessa, its pine needles rustling with disapproval.
Honey, that sensible black sweater is absolutely tragic. Haven't you heard of festive colors? Even a splash of burgundy would do wonders for your complexion.
Tessa stared at the wreath, then at Elias.
Does he have a name?
I never thought to give him one.
Elias admitted.
He reminds me of this theater critic I saw once.
Tessa mused, watching the wreath preen its berries.
Same attitude, same accent. Winston something or other.
The wreath perked up, its berries twinkling with delight.
Winston. Oh darling, how perfectly sophisticated. Much better than being called the wreath all the time. Though I would have accepted your majesty of holiday decor in a pinch.
Winston it is then.
Elias said dryly.
Though I fear we'll never hear the end of it now.
Quite right.
The newly christened Winston agreed, somehow managing to look even more pompous than before.
Now, about that dreadful arrangement of pine cones in the corner.
Tessa grabbed her laptop from her bag.
I need to document this. There has to be some logical explanation.
The screen lit up with dancing snowmen and twirling Christmas trees. Every click just brought up more holiday cheer.
What did you do to my computer?
That wasn't me.
Elias actually looked impressed.
The manor has a festive sense of humor.
A strand of tinsel materialized and tried to wind itself around her wrist. She flicked it away.
This is ridiculous. Christmas is just manufactured sentiment designed to boost fourth-quarter retail sales. And don't get me started on the environmental impact of all these decorations.
Elias stopped his pacing, frost swirling around his feet as he turned to face her. His expression shifted to something more serious, almost reverent. With an elegant gesture, the air between them shimmered like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Images formed, misty but clear enough to make out details. A younger version of Elias stood in what looked like the manor's grand hall, surrounded by floating spellbooks and glowing crystals.
Christmas Eve 1922.
He narrated, his voice taking on a formal, storytelling cadence.
I attempted what I believed would be my masterpiece, a spell to bring eternal winter festivities to Frosthaven. To make the joy and magic of the season last forever.
Tessa watched as the illusion Elias wove complex patterns in the air, magic swirling around him like a snowstorm.
That seems ill-advised,
she commented.
Did no one consider the economic implications of perpetual Christmas? The impact on retail cycles? Agricultural schedules?
The real Elias shot her a look that perfectly balanced aristocratic disdain with exasperation. The illusion continued, showing the spell spiraling out of control. Ice crackled across Frosthaven's streets, transforming cheerful decorations into twisted frozen monsters. Wreaths became thorny circles of ice, and candy canes curved into threatening hooks.
The local council wasn't pleased.
Elias continued dryly. A new scene showed stern-faced figures in elaborate robes, pointing accusatory fingers.
They bound me to the manor as punishment. A guardian of the very magic I'd misused, unable to leave until someone could break the curse.
The illusion faded, leaving behind a chill that had nothing to do with the manor's perpetual winter.
The first few decades were difficult. Isolation can do strange things to a person.
His fingers traced abstract patterns of frost on the nearest surface.
I started creating companions to keep me company. Simple things at first, enchanted books that could hold conversations, chairs that would rearrange themselves for optimal seating arrangements.
He walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered gardens.
Then one particularly lonely winter night, I built a snowman. Just something to talk to, really. But the spell.
He smiled slightly, remembering.
Well, I might have been a bit overzealous with the animation charm. Flurry developed quite the personality. And an unfortunate addiction to romantic holiday movies once television was invented.
As if summoned by his name, a small snowman waddled into view outside the window, apparently attempting to recreate a scene from The Notebook with two garden statues. His stick arms moved with surprising grace as he positioned the marble figures face to face in the falling snow.
Flurry,
Elias called through the glass.
Leave the statues alone.
The snowman turned, his coal eyes twinkling with unmistakable mischief. With a flourish worthy of a stage director, He produced a sprig of mistletoe from somewhere and held it hopefully over the statues' heads. Tessa watched this display with a mix of horror and fascination.
So not only did you create a sentient snowman, but you gave him access to streaming services?
In retrospect, perhaps not my wisest decision.
Elias admitted.
Though in my defense, I didn't expect him to become quite so invested in romantic storylines.
Flurry, apparently giving up on the statues, had now turned his attention to arranging pine cones into heart shapes on the garden path. Each one sparkled with a light dusting of magical frost.
I suppose we should be grateful he's moved on from his Bridgerton phase.
Elias muttered.
The historical accuracy critiques were becoming rather pointed.
Tessa pulled out her notepad, a familiar comfort in this increasingly bizarre situation.
Let me get this straight.
She drew a line down the middle of the page.
Pros and cons of staying at the possibly haunted, definitely cursed Christmas manor with a romantically obsessed snowman.
It's not haunted.
Elias protested.
Just enthusiastically enchanted.
Pro, understanding the property's unique features will help determine market value.
She wrote carefully, ignoring how her pen kept trying to write in red and green ink alternately.
Con, possible magical imprisonment. Pro, solving the curse might increase sale potential. Con, everything else about this situation.
Elias leaned against the counter, managing to look both hopeful and annoyed.
I suppose we could frame it as an extended property evaluation period.
Fine.
Tessa snapped her notebook shut.
I'll stay long enough to document these anomalies. For proper valuation purposes only. No promises about curse breaking or Christmas spirit or whatever this is.
Excellent.
Elias straightened, gesturing for her to follow.
Let me show you to your room. I believe the East Wing has the best views of the gardens. When they're not frozen solid, that is.
The room he led her to was beautiful in a gothic, slightly intimidating way. Right until she stepped inside. Immediately, garlands sprouted along the walls, a Christmas tree burst into existence in the corner, and tiny magical lights began stringing themselves across the ceiling.
No,
Tessa said firmly, grabbing a strand of tinsel and yanking it down. It reappeared on the bedpost, now with tiny bells attached. She pulled down the wreath over the fireplace. It rematerialized with a red bow twice the size.
Stop that.
I don't think arguing with the decorations will help.
Elias observed from the doorway, not bothering to hide his amusement.
Watch me.
She grabbed the miniature tree, marched to the window, and opened it. The moment she turned around, the tree was back, now with color-changing ornaments and what appeared to be real snow falling gently from its branches. A rainbow of Christmas lights spelled out, "Nice try," above her bed.
I'll leave you to get settled,
Elias said, backing away with a small bow that didn't quite hide his smirk.
Dinner is at 7. The dining room usually finds you, so don't worry about directions.
Tessa stood in her Christmas nightmare of a room, watching frost patterns race across the windows and listening to the faint strains of White Christmas coming from somewhere in the walls. She had a feeling her carefully ordered life was about to become significantly more festive. Chapter 3: Holiday Hexes. Tessa checked her watch for the third time in as many minutes. 7 o'clock. Right on cue, the floor beneath her feet hummed and the walls seemed to shift. Her room's door swung open with a cheerful creak, revealing a corridor she was certain hadn't been there before.
The dining room usually finds you.
She muttered, mimicking Elias's words.
Because that's totally normal.
Following the trail of mysteriously lighting candles, and pointedly ignoring the garland that kept trying to braid itself into her hair, Tessa found herself in a grand dining room. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and a massive fireplace crackled with blue-tinted flames. Elias was already seated at the head of an absurdly long table.
Ah, excellent. The manor guided you here without incident.
If by without incident you mean only slightly terrifying, then sure.
Tessa sat down, jumping when silverware materialized beside her plate.
Does anything in this place just stay put?
Where would be the fun in that?
Elias waved his hand, and covered dishes appeared down the table's length.
I thought we might start with a proper demonstration of holiday cheer. Watch this.
Speaking of creations,
The wreath, swooping dramatically around a stone gargoyle.
this Gothic nightmare of a dining room. The cobwebs and gargoyles are so last century. We need tinsel, darling. Lots of tinsel. And perhaps some fairy lights to brighten these dreary corners. It's Christmas, not Halloween.
The decor is perfectly fine.
Elias said stiffly, his shoulders tensing beneath his impeccably tailored coat.
Says the man who's been wearing the same style coat since Victoria was queen. Would it kill you to try a modern cut?
The wreath started humming, "Deck the Halls," adding its own commentary between verses about their table manners and occasionally tossing pine needles at particularly egregious etiquette violations. After enduring the wreath's running commentary through dinner,
Really, dear, that's your third bread roll. We're going for festive, not fluffy.
Elias practically jumped up from his chair.
Perhaps we should move to the kitchen for dessert? I'd love to show you the joy of magical holiday baking.
Joy might be pushing it.
Tessa said, but followed him anyway, her heels clicking against the stone floor. Anything to escape the wreath's critique of her aggressive fork grip and alarming lack of holiday spirit. The kitchen was warm and inviting, with copper pots hanging from the ceiling and ingredients already laid out on the counter in precise rows. A fire crackled merrily in the enormous hearth, and the whole room smelled of cinnamon and vanilla. Elias began explaining traditional Christmas customs while assembling what looked like an elaborate gingerbread house, his hands moving with practiced grace as he piped delicate frosting onto the roof.
The spell is quite simple.
He said, adding a final touch of frosting to a tiny window frame.
Just a bit of holiday magic to bring out the...
The gingerbread house glowed bright red, pulsing like a sugar-coated warning light. Tessa barely had time to say,
That doesn't look right.
before it exploded in a shower of cookies and candy. Dozens of tiny, cackling gingerbread men scattered in every direction, leaving trails of sprinkles in their wake.
Come back here, you little...
Elias lunged for the nearest one, who blew a raspberry and slid down a banister, leaving a streak of frosting behind.
They're drawing on the walls.
Tessa pointed to where several cookies were using frosting to graffiti Christmas puns onto the wallpaper.
With terrible dad jokes, no less. Why did the ornament go to therapy? Because it was deeply traumatized.
They chased the giggling cookies through the manor's twisting corridors, past suits of armor that tried helpfully to catch the escapees but only managed to get tangled in garlands. Tessa caught glimpses of rooms she hadn't seen before. A conservatory full of frozen flowers suspended in eternal bloom, a ballroom with enchanted instruments that played themselves, and finally,
Wait.
Elias called as she stumbled into a small study. But she'd already seen it, decades worth of Christmas decorations carefully preserved under glass. Solo photographs of Elias through the years, always alone, always with that same forced smile that never quite reached his eyes.
We should check the courtyard.
He said quickly, steering her away with a gentle but firm hand on her elbow.
Fresh air might help clear our heads.
Outside, snow fell in perfect spirals, each flake catching the moonlight like tiny stars. Elias waved his hands in an elegant gesture, and snow swirled upward like a reverse waterfall, forming a dapper-looking snowman complete with top hat and bow tie. Its coal eyes sparkled with suspicious intelligence.
Now this
Elias said, brushing a few snowflakes from his sleeve.
is pure winter joy.
The snowman immediately began singing, "Baby, It's Cold Outside" in a surprisingly smooth baritone while trying to nudge Tessa closer to Elias with its stick arms. She could have sworn it winked at her.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
Tessa dodged another push that sent her stumbling on the icy path.
Did you program it to be this pushy?
Absolutely not.
Elias looked mortified, a faint blush coloring his pale cheeks.
Though perhaps we should head back inside.
They retreated to the library, where more gingerbread men were using tinsel as zip lines from the chandelier, whooping with sugar-fueled glee. Tessa noticed Elias's gaze lingering on an old photograph album tucked between leather-bound spell books, his carefully maintained charm slipping for just a moment to reveal something raw and lonely underneath.
I say, this simply won't do.
The wreath had followed them, now addressing the snowman through the frost-covered window.
You're rushing things. Romance requires proper timing. Have you learned nothing from those holiday movies they show every year?
What do you know about timing?
The snowman shouted back, its carrot nose quivering with indignation.
You're just a glorified door decoration. At least I have legs.
How dare you? I am a certified holiday ambience expert. I studied under the great mistletoe masters themselves.
Tessa grabbed a net that had mysteriously appeared. The manor did seem to provide what they needed, even if its timing was questionable, and started corralling gingerbread men.
Less arguing, more helping. These cookies are starting to write limericks now, and they're getting inappropriate.
As they rounded up the last of the cookies, the wreath began an elaborate rendition of Can You Feel the Love Tonight, complete with harmony parts sung by ornaments.
That's not even a Christmas song.
Tessa protested.
Art knows no season, darling.
The wreath replied, launching into the chorus with even more enthusiasm. Chapter 4, Thawing Hearts. Evening settled over Winterheart Manor like a heavy velvet curtain, bringing with it a stillness Tessa hadn't experienced since arriving. She found Elias in the library, his tall frame silhouetted against the window as his fingers traced intricate frost patterns across the glass. Each swirl bloomed beneath his touch, creating delicate landscapes of ice that sparkled in the fading light. From its perch above the fireplace, Winston the Wreath had finally succumbed to exhaustion, its snores rising and falling in a melodic rendition of Silent Night. After the chaos of runaway gingerbread men and an overzealous matchmaking snowman, the quiet felt almost surreal.
Cider?
Elias asked softly, turning from the window. His usual dramatic flair was absent, as he conjured 2 steaming mugs with a simple gesture. The spiced aroma filled the air, mingling with the scent of old books and wood smoke. Tessa caught hints of cinnamon and star anise, along with something more exotic she couldn't quite identify, perhaps some magical variant of nutmeg.
Thanks.
Tessa accepted the mug, warming her hands around it, as Elias settled into a worn leather armchair across from her. His usual perfect posture relaxed slightly, and she noticed how the firelight softened the sharp angles of his face, casting dancing shadows that made him look almost human, rather than the ethereal being he usually appeared to be. Her attention drifted to the massive bookshelves surrounding them, each one stretching from floor to ceiling and packed with volumes of varying ages and sizes. Some seemed to pulse with barely contained magic, while others lay dormant beneath centuries of dust.
That one looks ancient,
she said, nodding toward a particularly ornate tome bound in midnight blue leather, its spine adorned with silver runes that appeared to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them.
My father's spellbook.
Something flickered across his face, pride tinged with melancholy.
He taught me my first charm when I was barely tall enough to reach his desk. Simple thing really, making snowflakes dance. I spent weeks practicing until I could make them waltz in perfect formation.
His fingers twitched slightly as he spoke, as if muscle memory was trying to recreate those childhood lessons.
Sounds like a patient teacher.
He was.
Elias smiled faintly, and for a moment Tessa caught a glimpse of the young boy he must have been, eager to please and full of wonder. He had such plans for this place. Wanted it to be a gathering spot for magical families, a place where traditions could be passed down through generations. His gaze drifted to the window, where real snow now fell in lazy spirals, each flake catching the last rays of twilight.
Instead, I've watched those traditions from behind glass for over a century. Every Christmas, every celebration, every moment of joy, always on the outside.
The flames in the fireplace dimmed slightly, and Tessa felt the temperature drop. Frost crept along the edges of her cider mug as Elias continued, his voice growing distant. The ice patterns reminded her of the ones he'd been drawing earlier, but these seemed less controlled, more raw with emotion.
You can't imagine what it's like, watching families grow old while you remain frozen in time. Children who once pressed their noses against these windows now walk past with grandchildren of their own, and I'm still here, paying for one moment of magical hubris.
His fingers tightened around his mug, and Tessa noticed a thin layer of ice spreading across its surface.
Do you ever think about that night?
Tessa asked softly, surprising herself with the gentleness in her voice. She hadn't meant to care this much, hadn't wanted to feel this pull of empathy toward him. Elias's fingers tightened around his mug, frost spreading across its surface.
Every day. The pride, the foolish certainty that I could force joy into being through sheer magical will.
He trailed off, shoulders tense, a muscle working in his jaw.
Sometimes I still hear the screams when the temperature dropped. If my father hadn't acted so quickly.
And now here you are, guardian of the very magic you once misused.
Tessa watched the firelight dance across his face, catching the shadows of century-old regret in his eyes.
Life has a peculiar sense of justice, doesn't it?
His laugh held no humor, the sound as brittle as thin ice.
Though I suppose there's a certain poetry in having my redemption tied to helping someone else rediscover what I once took for granted.
He studied her over his mug, his green eyes reflecting the firelight like captured stars.
What about you? What made you stop believing in the magic of the season?
Tessa opened her mouth, ready with her usual deflection about commercialization and forced cheer, but something in his expression made her pause. Maybe it was the way he'd shared his own pain, or maybe it was just the lateness of the hour, but she found herself speaking truth instead of sarcasm. The words felt rusty, unused, like opening a door long kept locked.
My parents turned Christmas into a battlefield,
She said, staring into her cider, watching the steam curl up in abstract patterns.
Mom insisted on perfect decorations, Dad complained about the expense. Every year they'd promise it would be different, that we'd have a real family Christmas this time. And every year, it ended in shouting matches about tinsel and turkey temperatures.
The memories rose unbidden, tense dinners, slammed doors, forced smiles and photos. Each one sharp and clear despite the years she'd spent trying to blur them away.
The last Christmas, I came downstairs to find divorce papers under the tree instead of presents. Mom had finally had enough. Dad moved out that afternoon, and I spent the rest of the day taking down decorations while she cried in her room.
As she spoke, tiny snowflakes began falling from the library ceiling, catching the firelight like diamond dust. Each one seemed to hold a different pattern, delicate and perfect. Tessa realized Elias probably wasn't even aware he was creating them, his magic responding to her pain as much as his own.
After that, it just seemed easier to treat December like any other month. No expectations, no disappointments. Just another 31 days to get through.
She traced a finger through the condensation on her mug, drawing meaningless patterns that disappeared as quickly as she made them. The manor creaked softly around them, and the shadows in the corners seemed to retreat. The fire burned warmer, casting a gentle glow that made the library feel like a sanctuary. Tessa was struck by how comfortable the silence felt, no need to fill it with empty words or forced holiday cheer. For the first time in years, sharing her Christmas wounds didn't feel like picking at scabs. A crash from the kitchen, followed by the distinctive giggling of escaped gingerbread men, broke the moment. But neither of them moved to investigate. The cookies could have their midnight raid. This quiet understanding felt too precious to disturb. Besides, Tessa thought she caught a hint of a real smile playing at the corners of Elias's mouth, the first she'd seen all evening that held no trace of sadness. They sat watching the snow fall, both outside and inside the library, until Winston's sleepy voice drifted down from above the fireplace.
Now that's what I call proper holiday atmosphere.
The wreath mumbled before his snores resumed their musical pattern. For once, Tessa didn't have the heart to argue with him. Chapter 5, Festive Chaos. Tessa had just finished her second cup of coffee, when Winston's voice rang through the foyer with all the subtlety of a holiday brass band.
Company's coming.
The wreath practically vibrated with excitement.
And not just any company, half the town I'd say.
What?
Tessa rushed to the nearest window, coffee cup still in hand, the ceramic warm against her palm as her heart rate spiked. Through the frosted glass, she spotted a growing crowd of bundled figures making their way up the manor's long driveway, their colorful winter coats dotting the snowy landscape like confetti.
Oh no. No.
Oh dear.
Elias appeared beside her, his usual composure slipping. The faint scent of winter pine that always accompanied him intensified with his anxiety. A strand of tinsel materialized out of nowhere and wrapped itself around his neck like a glittering python. He batted it away with elegant fingers, only to have another appear in his hair, catching the light like morning frost.
This is unexpected.
Can't you just?
Tessa waggled her fingers in what she hoped was a magical gesture, though she felt ridiculous doing it.
Make them forget about the manor or something?
That would be unethical,
he said primly, though the effect was somewhat ruined by the tinsel now forming a bow tie at his throat, twinkling with what Tessa could have sworn was mischievous intent.
Besides, memory charms are terribly complex and…
The doorbell chimed, its sound mixing with Winston's enthusiastic rendition of Here Comes Everybody, complete with improvised harmony parts that made Tessa's teeth ache.
Where's Flurry?
Tessa peered through another window, her breath fogging the glass.
Isn't he supposed to be guarding the gate?
As if in answer, the front door burst open with a gust of frigid air, and their supposedly stalwart snowman guardian waddled in, trailing snow and muttering about ambient lighting and perfect moment opportunities. His coal eyes gleamed with suspicious delight. Flurry. Elias hissed.
Your post
is less important than ensuring proper romantic atmosphere.
Flurry declared, producing an icicle from somewhere and using it to conduct an invisible orchestra with surprising grace. The chandelier dimmed obligingly, casting intimate shadows that made Tessa want to crawl under the nearest piece of furniture. Tessa barely had time to process this betrayal before the doorbell chimed again, the sound somehow more insistent this time. With no other choice, she straightened her sweater. Why hadn't she changed out of her comfort clothes? The coffee stain from breakfast was probably still visible, and opened the door.
Welcome,
Boomed a rotund man with impressive whiskers that seemed to have caught several snowflakes.
I'm Mayor Whitaker, and we've all come to greet our newest neighbor.
Behind him stood what looked like half of Frosthaven, armed with covered dishes and carol books, their collective breath creating a cloud of steam in the cold air. A woman near the front clutched what appeared to be a critique-ready notebook, and wore a badge declaring her Mrs. Peterson, Holiday Decor Committee Chair. The badge sparkled almost aggressively.
Oh, honey,
Winston called out, his berries practically vibrating with glee.
that wreath you're wearing is so last decade. And those pine cones? Plastic. Really?
Mrs. Peterson's gasp could have shattered icicles. Her perfectly coiffed hair seemed to bristle.
Well, I never. A talking wreath with the audacity to.
The audacity of good taste, darling. Something your craft store clearance bin clearly lacks.
Tessa watched in horror as her potential property value plummeted with each exchanged barb. Her stomach churned with mortification.
Please come in.
She managed, trying to redirect attention from the sass battle developing over her doorway.
The parlor is.
A war cry erupted from the kitchen, followed by the unmistakable sound of projectile cookies and the scent of scorched gingerbread.
The revolution will not be gingerbreadized,
Sang a tiny voice, accompanied by what sounded suspiciously like biscotti being used as percussion instruments against her good mixing bowls. Elias muttered something under his breath, raising his hand toward the kitchen. Ice crystals formed in the air, and promptly rearranged themselves into a perfect gleaming sculpture of Tessa mid-laugh. Another followed, then another, until the foyer hosted an impromptu gallery of frozen moments Tessa hadn't even realized he'd noticed. Her reading by the fire, her first attempt at magical baking, her face lit with wonder at the enchanted snow. Each crystal caught the light differently, creating rainbow prisms that danced across the walls.
oh my,
Said someone in the crowd, their voice carrying that particularly gleeful tone reserved for witnessing other people's embarrassment.
how romantic.
Flurry chose this moment to shove Tessa backward with surprising strength for a being made entirely of snow, causing her to stumble directly into Elias's chest. His winter-cool hands steadied her at the waist as they both looked up to find a sprig of mistletoe materializing above their heads, its berries suspiciously sparkly in a way normal plants definitely weren't.
Oops,
Flurry said, not sounding sorry at all, his coal eyes practically dancing with mischief.
how festive.
Tessa felt her face burning as she tried to extract herself from Elias's steadying grip, very aware of the amused twinkles in various townspeople's eyes and the way Mrs. Henderson was already whispering behind her hand to her bridge club cronies. Elias, for his part, seemed to have developed a sudden fascination with the ceiling's architectural details, though she couldn't help noticing his ears had gone slightly pink.
Come.
Mayor Whitaker saved them, ushering people toward the parlor with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent decades managing small-town social occasions.
Let's give Miss Marsh some breathing room.
Tessa found herself settled on a plush Victorian couch beside elderly Mr. Jenkins, whose kind eyes crinkled behind wire-rimmed glasses as he shared tales of the manor's history. His weathered hands gestured animatedly as he spoke, his bow tie slightly askew.
Used to be the heart of Frosthaven's Christmas celebrations,
He said warmly, patting her hand.
My grandmother told stories about magical nights here, dancing lights in the windows, music that played itself, snow that fell in perfect patterns. She swore the house itself knew just how to make everyone feel welcome.
Imagine that.
Tessa said weakly, watching a gingerbread man skateboard past on a stolen cookie sheet, leaving a trail of sprinkles in its wake. She was pretty sure that one had been wearing tiny sunglasses. A delighted shriek drew her attention to the grand piano, where several children had discovered the keys responded to their touch with harmonized holiday tunes, each note trailing sparkles of gold and silver. Without quite meaning to, Tessa found herself drifting over, drawn by memories of childhood recitals and quiet evenings at home. Her fingers brushed the keys, muscle memory from long ago lessons taking over as the first notes of Silent Night filled the air, clear and pure. The piano added harmonies she'd never learned, weaving counter-melodies that seemed to dance through the room, and warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the hot cider someone had pressed into her hand. The liquid smelled of cinnamon and something else she couldn't quite identify, starlight maybe if starlight had a scent.
All right, everybody.
Winston's voice cut through the general chaos, his evergreen needles bristling with enthusiasm.
Time for some proper caroling. And none of that grandma got run over nonsense, we're doing the classics. I want to hear some proper fa-la-laying.
The gingerbread men, apparently having exhausted their revolutionary fervor, formed a kick line that was surprisingly coordinated for cookies with no prior dance training. Flurry conducted with his icicle baton, adding interpretive dance moves that sent children into fits of giggles and made even the most dignified town elders crack smiles. Tessa found herself caught up in the moment, her usual cynicism drowned out by the genuine joy filling her inherited home. Even Elias seemed to have relaxed, the tinsel having arranged itself into a rather dashing scarf that complemented his eyes in a way she absolutely wasn't noticing. By the time the last guest departed, trailing goodbyes and thank yous, her cheeks hurt from smiling. She closed the door and leaned against it, unconsciously humming "Deck the Halls" under her breath and trying not to think about how natural it all had felt.
Well,
Elias said, his own smile softer than she'd seen before, making something flutter in her chest that she chose to blame on sugar cookies.
it seems the evening wasn't a total disaster.
Progress.
Winston declared from his perch, his berries twinkling with satisfaction.
And now, for my signature jazz arrangement.
Don't you dare.
Tessa warned, but she was still smiling as she headed for the kitchen to assess the cookie carnage. Chapter 6: Breaking the Curse. The library's morning light filtered through frost-edged windows, casting a gentle glow over towering shelves and scattered magical texts. Tessa paused in the doorway, coffee mug warming her hands, struck by the sight of Elias hunched over an ancient tome. His cursed ring caught the light, its usual bright gleam noticeably dimmer.
Found anything interesting?
She asked, trying to sound casual despite the flutter in her stomach at how his hair fell across his forehead when he looked up. The morning light caught the auburn strands, making them gleam like polished copper against the aged leather of the bookbinding.
Actually, yes.
He gestured her closer, long fingers tracing lines of text she couldn't quite read. The ancient pages carried that distinct smell of wisdom and time that seemed to permeate everything in this library.
These passages suggest magical bindings often have more to do with the bearer's perception than external conditions. Something about worthiness and self-acceptance being key components.
Fascinating.
Winston chimed in from his newly claimed spot above the fireplace, his berries twinkling with obvious delight.
You know, I've noticed something rather intriguing myself. The curse seems weaker whenever you actually enjoy yourself, Elias. Like yesterday, when that gingerbread man did its impression of you brooding by the window, the ring practically stopped glowing.
I do not brood.
Elias protested, but his lips twitched. The ring's glow flickered slightly, and Tessa's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. She noticed how the frost patterns on the windows seemed to lighten in response.
He's right,
She said, setting down her coffee and leaning closer to examine the ring. The metal felt cool even from inches away.
It's happening now too. When you smile, really smile, not that polite party face you do, the magic dims.
Elias flexed his fingers, studying the ring with new interest. His usual composed demeanor cracked slightly, revealing a glimpse of genuine hope.
That would explain quite a bit, actually.
Their contemplation was interrupted by Flurry bursting through the door, trailing sparkly snow and enthusiasm. His coal eyes sparkled with mischief as he announced,
Decoration time. The grand hall won't festoon itself.
Despite her usual resistance to holiday preparations, Tessa found herself caught up in the activity. She couldn't help noticing how Elias's magic flowed more naturally when he wasn't overthinking it, ornaments dancing through the air in graceful arcs when he laughed at her commentary, but dropping whenever he concentrated too hard on creating proper holiday cheer. The way his magic moved reminded her of leaves dancing in autumn wind, natural and free.
You're much better at this when you relax,
She observed, helping him untangle enchanted tinsel that had somehow tied itself into Celtic knots. Her fingers brushed against his as they worked, sending little sparks of awareness up her arm.
The magic seems to.
She turned and found herself nose to nose with him in the narrow space behind the Christmas tree, where Flurry had helpfully directed them both to fix a fallen ornament. The scent of pine and winter spices filled her lungs, mixed with something distinctly Elias.
Seems to what?
Elias asked softly, and Tessa momentarily forgot what words were. His eyes were impossibly green this close, flecked with gold in the filtered light. She managed eloquently, very aware of how his breath stirred her hair.
Flow better. When you're not trying so hard.
A crash from the other room mercifully broke the moment, though Tessa could have sworn she heard Flurry muttering about terrible timing as they hurried to investigate. Her heart was still racing, and she deliberately ignored Winston's knowing twinkle as they passed beneath him. The afternoon evolved into a whirlwind of preparation that Tessa was alarmed to find herself enjoying. She caught herself enthusiastically debating garland placement with Winston and stopped mid-sentence, startled by her own investment in the outcome. The wreath seemed to be humming with satisfaction at her unexpected holiday spirit.
Did I just spend 10 minutes arguing about pine cone positioning?
She asked weakly, wondering what had happened to her carefully cultivated cynicism.
Indeed you did.
Elias said, looking entirely too pleased. His curse ring was notably dim, she noticed.
And you were quite passionate about proper spacing methodology.
I hate everything,
She informed him, but couldn't quite suppress her smile. The warmth in her chest refused to be denied, no matter how much she tried to maintain her usual skepticism. Later, as sunset painted the manor in gold and cast long shadows through the frost-laced windows, Elias caught her hand. His touch was gentle, almost hesitant.
Would you like to learn something?
He asked, eyes bright with an almost boyish enthusiasm that made her heart do complicated things in her chest. The ring on his finger seemed to pulse gently, like a star coming to life.
Depends. Will it explode like the candy cane incident?
That was one time.
He protested, guiding her hands through the air with the delicate precision she'd come to associate with his spellwork.
Now focus on the cold, not the discomfort of it but the crystalline beauty. Picture snowflakes forming, each one unique, each carrying its own whisper of winter's magic.
Tessa tried to concentrate, but found herself hopelessly distracted by his proximity, the gentle pressure of his fingers directing hers, the way his voice softened when he explained magical theory. His breath ghosted against her ear, carrying the faint scent of peppermint and something older, like ancient books and frost-covered mornings. To her surprise, Tiny sparkles of frost began forming in the air between their joined hands, dancing and swirling like diamond dust.
I'm doing magic,
she whispered, wonder temporarily overwhelming her usual skepticism. The crystalline patterns seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat.
You are,
he agreed, and something in his tone made her look up. The warmth in his eyes sent heat rushing to her cheeks, and she could have sworn the temperature in the room rose several degrees despite the frost they were creating.
They're holding hands again,
a tiny voice stage whispered from behind a particularly large poinsettia.
And look at how the frost sparkles when they touch.
Shush,
another gingerbread man hissed, elbowing his companion with a shower of cookie crumbs.
You'll ruin the moment. Remember what happened with the candy cane incident.
If you're quite finished providing commentary,
Winston called from his wreath, his berries twinkling with barely suppressed amusement.
Perhaps you could make yourselves useful and finish hanging the holly. Those garlands won't arrange themselves, you know.
Everyone's a critic,
the first cookie grumbled, brushing off his frosted buttons.
As if you weren't the one who suggested we sprinkle mistletoe everywhere.
But they scampered off to help anyway, leaving trails of cinnamon-scented crumbs that somehow arranged themselves into tiny heart shapes on the floor. As evening settled over the manor like a velvet cloak, Tessa found herself following Elias into the conservatory. Stars winked through the glass ceiling like curious onlookers, and enchanted flowers bloomed despite the winter chill, their petals gleaming with an otherworldly iridescence. She was admiring a particularly enthusiastic poinsettia that seemed to be attempting to spell out something suspiciously romantic, when she noticed Elias had gone quiet.
What's wrong?
she asked, turning to find him staring at his ring with an unreadable expression. The blue stone seemed dimmer than usual, pulsing with an uncertain light.
I've been thinking,
he said slowly, his fingers absently tracing the runes that marked his centuries-old burden.
about what breaking the curse might mean. This manor has been my home for so long, through countless winters and endless nights. If the spell breaks, I'm not certain what will happen. Whether I'll be allowed to stay. Whether the magic that binds me here will simply vanish.
The thought hit Tessa like ice water, shocking her out of the warm contentment she'd been floating in. She'd been so focused on helping break the curse, she hadn't considered what might come after. The idea of the manor without Elias seemed wrong somehow, like a story missing its final chapter, like winter without snow.
I've been thinking too,
she admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. Her hands fidgeted with her sleeve, a nervous habit she thought she'd broken years ago.
about going back to my old life. Spreadsheets and client meetings and no magic. No enchanted wreaths giving decorating advice, or snowmen playing matchmaker or...
She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze.
No you.
Something shifted in Elias's expression, like sunlight breaking through winter clouds, and Tessa became aware of a suspicious rustling above them. She looked up to find mistletoe materializing in an unnecessarily elaborate display, accompanied by what sounded suspiciously like flurry giggling and the soft tinkling of magical bells.
Oh, for heaven's sake,
she started to say, but then Elias's hand cupped her cheek, his touch warming her skin despite the perpetual coolness of his curse, and words became entirely unnecessary. When he kissed her, the ring blazed bright enough to illuminate the whole conservatory, then dimmed to barely a glimmer, as if even ancient magic knew when to be discreet. Magic swirled around them like falling stars, and Tessa found herself thinking that maybe some holiday traditions weren't so bad after all, especially when they involved cursed manor lords who tasted like winter sunshine. Through the glass walls, she could vaguely make out Flurry and Winston exchanging what appeared to be a high five, though how exactly a wreath and a snowman managed this feat, she decided not to question, filing it away with all the other impossibilities she'd learned to accept. The gingerbread men had formed a conga line, their tiny voices raised in celebration as snow began falling outside in distinctly heart-shaped patterns. Somewhere in the distance, she could have sworn she heard sleigh bells, but that was probably pushing it, even for Winterheart Manor. But Tessa wasn't paying attention to any of that anymore, because Elias was kissing her again, and it felt exactly like magic. Chapter 7, Love and Magic. Tessa stood at the top of the grand staircase, trying not to fidget with her emerald green dress, as guests filtered into Winterheart Manor. The candlelight cast a warm glow over everything, making even the usually imposing Gothic architecture seem welcoming. Beside her, Elias radiated a quiet contentment that somehow made her nervous system settle, despite the crowd below.
Welcome to Winterheart Manor.
Winston's voice rang out as a young couple crossed the threshold. The wreath immediately launched into what sounded suspiciously like a Broadway-style number about their matching scarves, complete with key changes that would have made Andrew Lloyd Webber proud.
Those winter whites really bring out your complexion, Martha dear. And Harold, that scarf length is simply divine.
Flurry, wearing a tiny bow tie made of ice and what appeared to be miniature coattails crafted from fresh powder snow, waddled importantly between guests, gesturing with twiggy arms as he guided them toward the refreshments.
Right this way. Mind the gingerbread waiters. They're enthusiastic but occasionally overambitious with the serving trays. No, not that way, Mrs. Henderson, unless you want to end up wearing your hot chocolate.
As if on cue, a line of Cookie Butler hybrids pirouetted past, each balancing steaming mugs of hot chocolate with impressive precision. Their tiny frosted coattails swished in perfect synchronization as they performed what appeared to be a miniature kick line between servings. Tessa noticed with mild horror that they'd added sparkly sugar crystals to their lapels, making them look like edible versions of the Rockettes.
They've been practicing that routine for days,
Elias murmured close to her ear, making her shiver in a way that had nothing to do with his naturally cool presence. His breath carried the faintest hint of peppermint, and she found herself leaning slightly closer despite herself.
though I suspect they added the backflips without consulting anyone. The sugar crystal costumes are definitely new.
Tessa watched as one particularly daring gingerbread man launched himself into a perfect aerial flip, somehow managing not to spill a drop of cocoa. She winced as he stuck the landing with a triumphant sprinkle of cinnamon.
I'm just glad they're not trying to spell out "kiss him" with cookie crumbs anymore. Though I swear I caught Flurry teaching them to arrange themselves into heart shapes earlier.
Shall we?
Elias extended his hand, and Tessa noticed his cursed ring seemed different tonight. Its usual harsh blue glow had softened to something almost warm, like twilight on snow. She took his hand, letting him guide her down the stairs and onto the dance floor, trying to ignore the way Flurry was frantically dimming lights in their wake to create what he clearly thought was appropriate mood lighting. The moment they began to move together, magic sparked around them, not the usual calculated spells Elias cast, but something wild and joyful that made Tessa's skin tingle with recognition. Frost patterns bloomed beneath their feet, spiraling outward in delicate whorls that caught the candlelight like diamonds. Above them, streams of starlight wove through the air, creating a private cosmos just for them, complete with shooting stars that seemed to dance in time with their steps.
Show off,
Tessa muttered, but she couldn't keep the smile from her voice or suppress the warmth blooming in her chest.
I assure you, this isn't entirely intentional,
Elias replied, looking slightly flustered as golden sparkles began falling around them like warm snow. A few landed in his hair, making him look momentarily like some winter deity.
The manor seems to have developed its own ideas about appropriate dance floor ambience. Though I suspect Flurry's been giving it ideas from those holiday romance movies he's become addicted to.
The ring pulsed suddenly, matching the quickened beat of Tessa's heart. She felt it through their joined hands, a rhythm that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the manor, making the crystals in the chandeliers chime softly. Something was changing, awakening, like spring thawing winter's grip.
I think,
She said slowly, gathering her courage as she watched the warm light play across his features.
we should try that spell now. The one you showed me earlier?
Elias's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded. Without breaking their dance, he began to weave magic through the air, his movements as graceful as their waltz. This time, instead of fighting the unfamiliar sensations, Tessa let herself feel everything, the joy bubbling up inside her, the warmth of connection, the absolutely ridiculous happiness of watching a tiny snowman direct traffic while cookie people performed synchronized serving routines. She even embraced the flutter in her stomach when Elias pulled her closer to complete a turn. The spell caught fire, metaphorically speaking. Where Elias provided the raw power, Tessa's emotions seemed to shape it, sending it racing through the manor like a jubilant wind. Dark corners blazed with warm light, chasing away decades of shadows. The frozen fountain in the conservatory transformed into pure crystal, sending rainbow refractions dancing across the walls like aurora borealis. Even the stern-faced portraits in the gallery seemed to soften, ancient winter hearts smiling down at the celebration as if they'd just been waiting for permission to enjoy themselves, their painted eyes twinkling with knowing looks that made Tessa blush.
Everyone,
Winston called out, his usual snark replaced by genuine enthusiasm.
join me in a carol, won't you? And do try to stay on key, some of us have standards to maintain. No, Mr. Peterson, perhaps you should just mouth the words quietly.
The gathered townsfolk laughed and joined in, their voices filling the great hall with a warmth that seemed to chase away the last shadows of winter gloom. The manor's magic wove through the melody like golden threads, adding harmonies that shouldn't have been possible but somehow felt exactly right, as if the very stones had been waiting centuries to sing. Tessa found herself singing along, not caring that she was probably off-key, or that Winston was shooting her pointed looks, because Elias was looking at her like she'd just handed him the moon and all its stars. Then Fleury, who had apparently been waiting for exactly this moment with all the dramatic timing of a seasoned theater director, orchestrated his masterpiece. The manor's windows lit up one by one, frost crystallizing into perfect clarity as each pane displayed scenes like movie screens made of frost and starlight. There was their first meeting, all awkward tension and skepticism, with her practically bristling at his old-world formality. The disaster with the enchanted cookie dough that had chased them through 3 rooms before finally settling down. The quiet evening by the fire when they'd first started to understand each other, sharing stories over spiced cider. The moment under the mistletoe that had left them both blushing and breathless.
Oh God.
Tessa buried her face in Elias's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of pine and magic, as the crowds cooed appreciatively. Her cheeks burned hot enough to melt snow.
Your snowman is a menace. An absolute menace with delusions of being Steven Spielberg.
Our snowman,
Elias corrected, sounding entirely too amused as his hand found the small of her back.
and he's rather proud of his cinematography skills. Though I must say his angle choices are quite artistic.
As midnight approached, Tessa felt the magic in the air change, becoming charged, expectant, like the moment before lightning strikes. The ring on Elias's finger began to glow brighter, its usual icy blue warming to molten gold that cast dancing shadows across his face. Looking up at him, she saw equal parts hope and fear in his eyes, the same expression he'd worn when she'd first discovered the truth about his curse.
Tessa,
She kissed him before he could finish, because some things didn't need words, and she'd spent enough time being practical and cautious. The ring blazed like a miniature sun, and suddenly the air was thick with released magic. Decades of holiday spells unspooling all at once in a spectacular display of light and wonder that put every fireworks show to shame. Golden snowflakes filled the air, each one containing a different Christmas memory, spinning and dancing like stars come down to earth. The ring, no longer needed, slipped easily from Elias's finger and dissolved into stardust that sparkled as it fell. The gathered crowd erupted in cheers. Somewhere in the background, Winston was declaring this,
the most romantic Christmas ever,
while Fleury dabbed at his coal eyes with what appeared to be a handkerchief made of frost. The gingerbread men had formed a conga line that wound through the celebrating townsfolk, their tiny voices raised in victory. Chapter 8, A New Beginning. Tessa stood in the doorway of Winterheart Manor, as dawn painted the sky in gentle pinks and golds, her heart hammering against her ribs. After a century of confinement, Elias was about to step beyond the gate. She'd spent the night alternating between joy at breaking the curse, and terror that he'd walk away from the manor and her forever, eager to explore a world that had changed so dramatically during his imprisonment. Elias paused at the gate, his hand hovering over the latch. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he shifted his weight, and Tessa held her breath, her fingernails leaving half-moon impressions in her palms. The morning light caught in his auburn hair, making it glow like autumn leaves, and she could see the slight tremor in his fingers as he finally pushed the gate open. The ancient iron hinges creaked in protest, as if even they were uncertain about this momentous change. He took one step. Then another. The snow settled around his feet like powdered sugar, unmarred and perfect. Tessa's fingers dug into the doorframe as she watched him stand there, free for the first time in 100 years. The world stretched out before him, full of possibilities and adventures and everything he'd missed. Her chest ached with a mixture of joy and fear she couldn't quite untangle. A car passed on the distant road, and she saw him start slightly at the unfamiliar sound. Then he turned back, and the smile he gave her could have melted every snowbank in Frosthaven. Her heart did a complicated little dance in her chest.
Well,
He said, walking back up the path toward her with that elegant grace she'd come to adore, his coat swirling dramatically around his legs.
shall we have breakfast? I believe I promised to show you how to make proper French toast without setting off the magical fire suppressant system.
Relief flooded through her so intensely her knees went weak.
You're staying?
She hated how vulnerable her voice sounded, but couldn't quite manage to hide it.
Of course.
He reached the door and took her hand, his fingers warm despite the winter chill, his thumb brushing softly across her knuckles.
Where else would I want to be?
Over breakfast, French toast that was only slightly singed, despite Tess's skeptical monitoring of the enchanted cooking implements, Winston held court from his place above the dining room archway, his berries twinkling with enthusiasm as he outlined his vision for the manor's future. A few stray sparkles drifted down like snow whenever he got particularly excited.
Picture it.
He declared in that affected British accent he refused to drop, despite Tess's repeated reminders that he was from Connecticut.
Year-round holiday magnificence. Easter egg hunts with eggs that change color based on the finder's personality. Halloween parties where the ghosts are actually just magical illusions, much more reliable than real spirits, absolutely dreadful party guests, those. And Christmas. Oh, the Christmases we'll have. Think Dickens meets Disney, but with better lighting effects.
The wreath has a point.
Tessa admitted, trying not to laugh as Elias attempted to remove syrup from his sleeve, where a particularly enthusiastic gesture had caused him to miss his plate. The sight of the usually composed wizard dabbing at his coat with a napkin, while muttering archaic cleaning spells under his breath, was oddly endearing.
We could do something special here. Something that combines both our strengths.
Before Elias could respond, Flurry burst into the room with all the subtlety of a sugar-rushed toddler, leaving a trail of miniature snowflakes in his wake as he waved what appeared to be a business proposal written in frost on construction paper. The temperature dropped several degrees with his entrance.
Now that my matchmaking services are no longer required,
The snowman announced, practically vibrating with excitement.
I have a new career path.
He thrust the papers at them, sending a few loose snowflakes spinning through the air.
Winter workshops for children. Magical snow fort engineering. Advanced snowball trajectory calculations. Proper carrot nose maintenance.
Tessa caught Elias's eye across the table, and had to bite her lip to keep from giggling at his expression of fond exasperation. His green eyes sparkled with barely contained mirth.
We'll take it under advisement.
She managed. After breakfast, they explored the manor together, discovering rooms that had been sealed away by the curse. Each door they opened revealed new treasures, centuries of holiday decorations preserved in perfect condition, magical artifacts that made the air sparkle with possibility, and even a collection of enchanted music boxes that played forgotten carols. Tessa found herself reaching for Elias's hand more often than strictly necessary, but he never seemed to mind, squeezing her fingers gently each time she did.
Look at this.
Tessa breathed, holding up a delicate glass ornament that seemed to contain an entire winter landscape inside it.
We could use these for displays, show people how holiday magic has evolved over the centuries.
Careful with the inventory,
Called a tiny voice, and they turned to see one of the gingerbread men, now apparently self-appointed head of housekeeping, directing his fellows in an elaborate dusting operation. As they watched, the small, spicy army broke into a choreographed musical number about proper furniture polish application. Tessa couldn't help but smile as their tiny voices harmonized about the virtues of lemon oil versus beeswax, complete with synchronized feather duster twirls. Later, in Elias's study, Tessa spread out her revised business plan while he peered over her shoulder, his presence warm and solid behind her. The heat of him seemed to chase away the perpetual chill of the manor, making her skin tingle where they almost touched.
See? We can combine your magical knowledge with modern business practices. Make the manor a destination that celebrates both tradition and innovation.
She turned to gauge his reaction, and found him watching her with such tenderness it made her throat tight. Something in his green eyes made her heart stutter in her chest.
What?
You're remarkable,
He said simply and kissed her. His lips were soft and cool against hers, tasting faintly of peppermint and possibility. They were interrupted by the arrival of what seemed like half the town, bearing everything from casseroles to hand-knitted blankets to potted plants. The manor's halls filled with laughter and conversation as people explored, exclaiming over the newly revealed rooms and offering suggestions for future events. Tessa watched in amazement, as the community she'd always thought of as reserved and traditional embraced the manor's magic with open arms.
We could have wedding receptions in the ballroom,
Called Mrs. Henderson from the local bakery.
The courtyard would be perfect for summer markets.
Mr. Chen from the hardware store was already sketching layouts on the back of an envelope.
Does the magical cooking equipment take special requests?
This from several people at once, eyeing the kitchen's enchanted implements with obvious interest. Tessa found herself swept up in the impromptu town meeting that had invaded the manor, somehow ending up with a clipboard and taking notes as everyone shouted increasingly enthusiastic suggestions. The manor seemed to glow with all the positive energy, its usual gothic gloom replaced by warm light streaming through previously shadowed windows.
We could do historical reenactments,
Called out the local librarian, her glasses fogging up with excitement.
think of all the holiday traditions through the centuries. The gardens would be perfect for a spring flower show,
Mused Mrs. Chen, already marking spots on the rough blueprint her husband had sketched.
especially with a little magical assist for the blooms.
Tessa glanced at Elias, who stood slightly apart from the crowd, his expression a mixture of wonder and mild panic at having so many people in his space. She could practically see him fighting the urge to straighten picture frames and adjust throw pillows in their wake. His fingers twitched every time someone brushed against an antique vase or leaned too enthusiastically on a delicate end table. She made her way to his side, letting her shoulder brush against his in silent support.
You okay?
I haven't seen the manor this alive in decades.
He admitted softly. His voice carried a note of vulnerability that made her heart squeeze.
It's rather overwhelming.
Before she could respond, Flurry zoomed past them, leading a conga line of gingerbread men who were all wearing tiny party hats fashioned from paper doilies.
Conga line forming in the conservatory.
The Snowman announced.
No previous dance experience required. Non-melting refreshments provided.
Should we be worried about that?
Tessa asked, watching as several townspeople actually joined the line, laughing as they followed the enthusiastic Snowman.
Probably.
Elias said dryly.
But I find myself caring less about potential chaos than I used to.
He gave her a sidelong glance that made her cheeks warm.
I wonder who could be responsible for that change in perspective.
From his perch above the main entrance, Winston cleared his throat dramatically.
If we could all gather round.
The wreath called out in his affected accent.
I believe this occasion calls for a proper musical number.
Oh no,
Tessa groaned, but she was smiling despite herself.
he's been watching too many movie musicals again, hasn't he?
I blame the late-night Hallmark marathon,
Elias murmured, his breath tickling her ear.
though I suspect Flurry's Disney Plus subscription didn't help matters.
The wreath began to glow softly, his berries twinkling like tiny stars as he started humming. To Tessa's horror and secret delight, Flurry and the gingerbread men assembled beneath him, arranging themselves like a proper choir. The Snowman produced a tiny conductor's baton made of ice and tapped it against a nearby side table.
I wrote this one myself.
Winston announced proudly.
I call it Home is Where the Heart Thaws.
The melody that filled the air was surprisingly sweet, with the gingerbread men providing gentle harmony, while Flurry conducted with dramatic flourishes. Magical sparkles drifted down from Winston's branches, creating a shimmer in the air that caught the late afternoon light streaming through the windows.
When winter's chill meets summer's heart, and magic makes a brand new start. Sometimes love needs a little push. Or maybe just a wreath's soft touch.
Tessa couldn't help but laugh at the wreath's self-congratulatory wink during that line. The townspeople had gone quiet, watching the performance with varying degrees of amazement and amusement.
Through frost and fears and walls so high, past doubts that clouded summer's sky, two hearts that thought they knew their way, found home was where they chose to stay.
The gingerbread men swayed in perfect unison, their tiny voices rising in the chorus. Flurry got so caught up in conducting that he started to spin, creating a small flurry of snowflakes that danced in time to the music. Tessa felt Elias's hand slip into hers, his thumb tracing gentle patterns across her knuckles. The touch sent warmth spreading through her chest, melting away the last bits of ice around her heart. She leaned into him slightly, allowing herself to fully embrace the moment instead of analyzing it or searching for problems to solve.
For home's not just a place to be, but where your heart can wander free, where magic meets reality, and love grows wild and fancy-free.
As the song continued, the manor itself seemed to join in, creaking and settling in harmony. The fireplaces crackled in rhythm, and even the ancient chandeliers swayed gently, their crystals catching the light and sending rainbow reflections dancing across the walls. Mrs. Henderson wiped away a tear with the corner of her apron.
Well, if that isn't the sweetest thing I've ever seen in all my years of Christmas pageants.
And I've never seen such well-coordinated gingerbread men,
Mr. Chen added, looking impressed.
though their choreography could use a bit of work in the second verse.
One of the gingerbread men shot him an offended look and executed a perfect pirouette, presumably to prove him wrong. The song built to its finale, with Winston's berries glowing brighter and Flurry's conducting becoming increasingly enthusiastic. Several of the gingerbread men had to dodge his wildly swinging baton.
So welcome home to where you belong, where every heart can sing its song, where curses break and joy takes flight, and magic makes the world feel right.
As the last note faded, the magical sparkles settled around them like starlight. Tessa felt Elias turn toward her, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, and she could see all the words he wasn't saying reflected in his eyes.
You know,
She said softly,
for someone who spent a century stuck in one place, you make anywhere feel like home.
the smile that spread across his face was brighter than any Christmas light she'd ever seen. He leaned down, and this time when their lips met, she could feel the magic humming in the air around them, warm and welcoming and full of possibility. Someone in the crowd, probably Mrs. Henderson, let out a delighted squeal. Flurry dropped his conductor's baton with a clatter, and the gingerbread men broke into spontaneous applause. Winston started humming the wedding march, not so subtly, until one of the berries fell off his branches from the effort. Tessa pulled back just enough to rest her forehead against Elias's, laughing softly.
I think we're going to have our hands full managing this bunch.
He asked, his voice holding a note of hopeful vulnerability that made her heart flutter.
Well,
She said, gesturing at the chaos around them. Flurry was now attempting to organize a flash mob, while the gingerbread men debated the merits of various dance styles, and Winston offered increasingly dramatic suggestions from above.
someone has to help you keep this magical menagerie in line. Besides,
She added more softly,
I think I finally found where I belong.
the look of pure joy that spread across his face was worth every moment of doubt, every sarcastic defense mechanism she'd had to lower, every fear she'd had to face. He pulled her close again, and as their lips met, she could have sworn she heard the manor itself sigh contentedly around them.
Oh, splendid.
Winston declared from above.
Now, about the wedding planning, I'm thinking enchanted ice sculptures, self-playing orchestras, and perhaps a few strategically placed mistletoe portals.
Winston, Tessa and Elias said in unison, not breaking apart.
Right, getting ahead of myself.
The wreath conceded.
But you can't blame a fellow for dreaming. Now, everyone, from the top. this time with feeling.
As the impromptu choir launched into another verse, Tessa nestled closer to Elias, breathing in the scent of peppermint and magic that always surrounded him. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and perfect, each flake catching the light like tiny stars falling to earth. Inside, the manor hummed with warmth and life and possibility, no longer a prison but a home, filled with the kind of magic that came from finding exactly where you were meant to be. Thank you for listening to my book. I hope you enjoyed it, and please comment and subscribe. I'd love to hear from you. Visit me at https://winvalentine.com to stay up to date.